This is the second video lecture on the chapter of race and ethnicity. In the previous lecture, we were discussing the concept of race and how it's a social construct and there's only one race. In this lecture, I want to talk about ethnicity. So often, the concept of race and ethnicity is often confused. Whereas race refers to some sort of biological rate or some sort of biological difference. It's I don't want to say it's like, but it's similar to sex, right? So where sex is biological, race is also some sort of external biological difference that we give social meaning to. Ethnicity is considered culture. So ethnicity is not how one looks. An ethnicity is how one organizes their life, like their religion or their language or the part of the world that they come from. We do in our culture get these confused. For example, when we refer to people from Mexico as a race, when we refer to Latinos or Latinx, I believe is the term that is the appropriate term these days, that is not a race. That is actually an ethnic group because that refers to the part of the world where people come from. The same thing with Jews, with Jewish people. Jewish people are not a race, they are an ethnic group. Jewishness refers to one's religious background. It is true that sometimes Jewish people and Latino people look alike, but as we were talking about in the previous lecture, that's because they come from the same part of the world or they intermarry, they have passed on genetic information that result in physical differences in appearance. Not so ethnicity is one's culture. Trying to think of some other examples. Is one's culture, we define it as unique cultural traits often associated with language, with place where people come from. So sometimes it would be an interesting conversation to have, what does an ethnic American look like, right? So Americans look really different. Can we distinguish? Does it mean that you have to speak English? There's a lot of Americans who don't speak English. Does it mean you're Christian? We have a lot of Americans that are not Christian. So what exactly is an ethnic American? In my faith tradition, Mennonites, we talk about ethnic Mennonites as opposed to converts. And when we use that phrase, we refer to people whose ancestors were also Mennonite. They may be there's a stream of Mennonites who were both Russian, and then there's another stream who were German. So there are people whose faith tradition, whose religion, they share the same religion, but some of them come from Russia and some of them come from Germany. So again, ethnicity refers to one's culture, a unique cultural trait. Often ethnic groups have they have a shared sense of community. So like when I do my service work with my Mennonite friends, they'll say, "Oh, you're a German or you're a Russian Mennonite," based on the kinds of food they eat, based on what they call certain things, based on their language. So there is this sort of sense, maybe not so different from fandoms, right? If I were to use Star Trek lingo as opposed to Star Wars lingo, another person in my Star Trek group would say, "Oh, you're a Trekkie." Oh, because we have the shared understanding or a shared language. A feeling of ethnocentrism. So going back to the chapter 2, when we were talking about what was good and what's bad about ethnocentrism, this is one of the goods, one of the potential goods of being ethnocentric, especially when your group is small. When you have a small ethnic group, when there are just a few of you, so maybe Manhattan would be a good example because we have a very small Muslim community in Manhattan, and an even smaller Jewish community. That's my understanding, at least, right? And there's a sense that people are proud of their faith tradition. They're proud of their ethnic identity, and that keeps them cohesive, right? So there's the sense that my culture, my ethnic group is good, and it is worthy of solidarity, and worthy of preservation. One's much like race is something that is declared or defined by outsiders. Ethnicity is a little bit like that too. It's considered what sociologists call ascribed at birth. So what that means is where you come from is you will always come from there, right? Your ethnic identity, if you were born into, I'm watching this silly PBS show about World War II. If you were born to Jewish parents, you will always be considered Jewish. You will always be, if you are born, if you are a descendant, and of course in World War II, people were trying to hide that fact, right? If you were born to Barack Obama dealt with a lot of this, right, because of his name. And so part of one aspect of ethnicity is the name that we give our children. And people use the fact that his biological father was he Muslim? I don't know, anyway, but that his biological father had this particular name, they then associated him with a certain ethnic group, right? So you're born into your faith tradition if you have one. You're born into the nation, the part of the world that you are, your motherland, and you will always be born into your motherland. And then often it's territorial. So often ethnicity is determined by one's place. So religion is part of that, but also place and language. Our world, we have people are separate. We talked about this before too, but people are separated in part based on geographical aspects. So this would be, if we were all together, I would ask you a question about where do your people come from? What is your ethnic heritage? An old assignment I used to have was called Doing Your Ethnic Work. And I had invited, in that one, students are invited to answer that question. Because if you are in the United States, unless you are a First People, unless you are, I don't like to use the term Native American because that's a classic example of how that label, Native American, was given the Europeans. The white Europeans gave that label to the people that were already here. And the people that were already here already had identities. But the Europeans came in and called them all the same group, called them all Native Americans. So I like to use the term First Peoples because that's what they were. They were the people that were here first. They were the people that came before my ancestors did. So unless you are a First People, unless you are an indigenous person to this continent, we are all immigrants. And there is a huge, one of the great scholars I remember listening to was talking about all the variety and the diversity in the United States, and that's because we have coasts. We have an ocean on the East Coast and an ocean on the West Coast, and that means people came from all over the world. They came to the East Coast and they came to the West Coast, and that results in this huge ethnic variation. So in this chapter, I would go around the room and I would say, where do your people come from? Why did they come here? And it's fascinating that the longer our people have been here, the less we're able to answer that question. Recent immigrants know precisely what generation their people came. They know why they came. They know where they settled. They may even continue to engage in their ethnic heritage. People like mine that have been here, some of my ancestors came on the Mayflower in 1620. You know, I don't know. We don't know when they came. I mean, now the only reason we know, my family knows is my mother's done all this, blah, blah, blah. But, and it's usually white people. If I go around the room, it's usually white people. They say, I don't know. I think we came from Germany. But if you're not white, if you are a descendant of an African slave, you may not even know what nation, that your people came from or their original names. And so this is some of the social inequity. This is the social inequity that's associated with even our own ethnic heritage, our own stories. White folk who are descendants or who are 10, 12 generations descendant of immigrants, we don't need to know that story because we are ethnic Americans, even though we're really not ethnic Americans, right? But when we're more recent immigrants, we know our story. It's actually, there's actually been documented, and it's called the immigration effect. And one observation about more recent immigrants is they are often more entrepreneurial. They're more educationally motivated um, than generations that have been here for a long time. But anyway, that would be a fun conversation to have too. I mean, there's also some. So like my mom's people immigrated. Um, he was a merchant on the Mayflower. He was there just to make money. But I did actually find this in the ancestry that my father's people, there's indication that they were indentured. So they were quite poor. And there's not a whole lot of record, where when you're wealthy, there's records as you pass down your resources. So that's often that's a fun conversation to have. Okay, the next box, and then I'm going to end this video lecture, is the concept of dominant versus subordinate, right? Or minority versus majority. Sociologically, when we talk about majority, we are not talking about numbers. I think we mentioned this when we were talking about feminism too. Majority in this case refers to the group that has more power. We might use dominant, right? The group that has more power. White people are considered the majority group, even though it is estimated, I want to say by 2025, that white people will not be the numerical majority. Anyone know what the numerical majority will soon will look like? They are not going to be white people with blue eyes. Indeed, they will be dark complected, dark eyes people will be the numerical majority, but most likely, at least for a spell, remain the subordinate, the group or minority, which refers to power, right? So dominant majority, at least sociologically, if we were in math, we would be talking about numbers.
It's 12 o'clock.
Right? We are in sociology, so we were talking about power. Dominant is greater power, subordinate is less power. And in fact, the subordinate group, remember the triangle, right? Remember the triangle? Whole lot of people down at the bottom, right? They are the subordinate, even though numerically they are the majority. Because again, it's not about numbers, it's about power. I'm going to stop this lecture right here, this video, and in the next one, we'll talk about prejudice and some of the theories about prejudice.